everybody, welcome back to the channel. I'm starting a new playlist called Classic Reads, where Mark Tiedemann and I plan to talk about science fiction or fantasy stories, or I guess really anything that strikes our fancy, and what we think about them, the plots, the characters, moral choices that people make. Today we're going to talk about The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin. And I have to say, she is one person I always kind of wanted to meet, but not for the reason you might think. Because the K there in the middle stands for Kroeber, and she's a daughter of Alfred Kroeber. And as an anthropology major, I got to read a lot about Alfred Kroeber. And so I would have probably been terribly like fanboy kind of thing about her dad. I'd be like, oh, Ursula Le Guin, daughter of Kroeber, but didn't get that chance. So, oh well. But thanks, Mark, for showing up. And let's talk about The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. So you want to give some opening thoughts about it? Should we just give a short plot summary, or we assume that people are watching this know the story?
We can assume that people watching this know the story, or they might not have chimed in. But for those off chance who stumbled on this, there's virtually no plot. It's a description of an idyllic community called Omelas, which has somehow managed to rise above all of the petty discontents of what we know to be civilization, and they have a peaceful community with few laws because they're not necessary. There's prosperity. It's everything we dream of a civilization can be. The fly in the ointment is that it all rests on a mutual agreement, and she makes it clear that this is a mutual agreement, that there's going to be one kid locked in a basement who is lonely and isolated and suffers. And that kid has to be there in order for everybody else to enjoy what they have. That's the trade-off. She doesn't explain how that's supposed to work, but basically the kid becomes the global sin eater in a way of the entire enterprise. And it's not a secret. People know he's there. The kid is there. Could be a girl or a boy. It changes from time to time, obviously. And people go and visit. They can go in and see, but they're told you cannot interact. You may not say anything specifically not anything kindly. Mm-hmm. You just have to let the kids suffer. And there are those who, once they've seen the child, leave the basement, and then they just keep walking. They go away. They go somewhere, and they're the ones who walk away because they can't accept the trade-off, the moral trade-off. It's one of those stories that I admire because it carries itself off from sheer chutzpah. If you start to break it down logically, nothing works. It just won't hold together. But Ursula Le Guin, in 10 short pages, gives you this image that is so compelling and so magnetic that you have to finish the story and you have to grapple with the equations in it. That's what's called being a terrific writer. Her and Boyhe and a few others. But you can endlessly talk about the flaws in the story, but her point was we make this kind of a trade-off all the time. We just don't always see it. So
yeah, we don't even know. She doesn't tell us who came to this conclusion or if it's real. Just because everybody's agreed on it doesn't mean that if they rescued the child, their civilization would collapse. We're not, it's not like someone says, well, here's the charter we all signed, or here's the deal we made with this particular god or something. It's just he was told that's the deal. And there might be no deal, or maybe there is. We don't know. Neither do they, but they live with it. Right. So yeah, talked about this with my students last week. I hope they got something out of it. This is a short story. It was short enough that I could read it in class and we could still talk about it. Because it's very striking, and it's the way it's told is very even tempered. The narrator's just kind of telling you this. And the narrator doesn't think you're going to believe them, right? They keep saying, oh, is this too fantastic? Is this too unbelievable? Yeah. Well, let me tell you one more thing. And then the one more thing is to tell you about the child. And the things we're told are pretty horrific. The child remembers sunshine, remembers the sound of its mother's voice. And it says in the beginning, it cried a lot at night for someone to help, cried for help, but eventually it doesn't make so much noise anymore, and now it's all covered in
Yeah.
sores and things. So it's probably going to live too much longer. But
Right.
because it remembers its life outside the closet, because that's a part of what makes it miserable, right? It can remember when life wasn't like this. When you said somebody gave up their kid, right? That some mother out there whose voice it remembers, it was approached and said, "Well, your child's been chosen somehow. We don't know how they do that. We're not told." And apparently she went, "Well, all right. I want to live in Omelas and I want to have this perfect life. So yeah, I'm turning my kid over to you to be neglected to death." It's just interesting to think about, right? That somebody had to just say, it's fine. And they didn't just grab their child and run away from the city,
Right.
But, or maybe somebody did, they just went to the next person and said, "Okay, we're taking your kid." So
Actually,
until you get someone to turn a kid over, because there's no police and we've got very few laws, so there's like no one who can make you turn your kid over, right? There's no
Right.
security forces, there's no army.
No.
You just have to be like, "Okay, we're taking your kid." And you have to say, "Well, all right, there you go, bye."
Yeah, but we understand how social pressure works without even it having to be spoken, at least in less dramatic ways, but nevertheless equally devastating ways, where it's simply agreed upon that no, you don't question this. If you do, then
Well, you
pause.
can't stay, right? I mean, if you were someone who decided, "No, I'm not going to sacrifice my child," you would have to run away. I mean, you couldn't just stay, and your neighbors aren't going to just like go get away with that.
There, excuse me, I had to send something that was making noise in the background. Well, it just occurred to me that this is very much like Sophie's Choice, which is a much more plausible scenario where it's one guy, a bureaucrat, one woman, and two children, and here's your choice. You can have your freedom, but you give up one of the kids. And in Sophie's Choice, obviously, she made that choice. She gave up one of the kids so she could take the other one and get away from Nazi Germany. And then the novel follows the consequences of that on her, which are all internal. And of course, when you're young enough and you may be presented with something like this, you think it's not going to haunt you for the rest of your life. Le Guin makes it fairly clear that all these people are quite contentedly living here. So obviously they have made it an accommodation. And I don't believe she uses that particular word in the entire story, accommodation, which in this context become quite a dirty word. But the reality that she's basing that on is that we make that trade-off all the time in a million small ways and either ignore it or are never told about it or find some way to dismiss the impact on ourselves by saying, well, they deserve it. We do it always. So I thought when I first read this story that when I first read the story, I thought, "Oh, you're kind of moralizing here." But then, well, yeah, duh, you're moralizing. And is your moral point valid? Your moral point is very valid. Would people, in fact, make that choice? It's sad to say yes, and frightening to admit that people who we know would make that choice will do everything in their power to shut you up when you point that out. It's not us, it's them. We couldn't possibly do that. Oh, that didn't happen. Holocaust.
Yeah, I mean,
species of that.
the big ones. Yeah, my students and I were coming up with examples of things. It's like, well, if your T-shirt was made in Bangladesh by some 13-year-old girls getting in a sweatshop, makes like 5 cents a week or something, that made your T-shirt only $10.
Yeah.
Or whatever it is you do. I saw something recently. This lady who had eaten Chick-fil-A and then discovered they had a vice president of diversity and decided that wasn't proper. So she went across the road and started eating at Cane's instead. Except Cane's also is pretty infamous for giving money to like Pride Month and stuff. So she didn't quite escape the diversity thing by changing chicken shops, but she tried. Right? She tried to walk away from the vice president of diversity at Chick-fil-A. So, I mean, you can try, I guess, if you spot, some company did something you don't like, so you don't shop there anymore. But then it's like, okay, so where do you eat lunch? Is there anybody you can eat lunch at? Is there any chain restaurant that isn't,
Well,
is there any restaurant? Is there any store? Is there any, what do you do? Can you walk away even? Is it even possible?
this is the structure of getting by that we live in, which the added thing to that is you can certainly walk away from Chick-fil-A. If enough people do that and they struggle, they're going to start laying off employees to make up their bottom line who have no part in that. So if the protest becomes significant enough, you end up doing damage to all the people stuck in the middle. Um, all of these trade-offs are like a giant game of what's that one where you pull the pieces out and the whole thing collapses again?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The unintended consequences.
The unintended consequences.
Yeah, we had a pastor from South Africa, and she was Zulu, and she was telling us, actually, they were telling us that one of the unintended consequences of getting rid of apartheid was there was the local white landowner near where they grew up. He was the way that all the Zulus got their stuff to market, right? They sold it to him, like I said, sharecroppers, I guess, and then he would take it off to Pretoria or Joburg or wherever, And when apartheid was done away with, he decided that, he didn't care for that. And so he just left. He didn't sell his land or anything. He just walked away, which, everyone was happy to get rid of apartheid, I guess. But then these people didn't have anywhere to sell their goods either because they didn't have the wherewithal to get it to the markets.
Right.
So, it was like, okay, so on the one hand, yay, no apartheid. On the other hand, how are these people going to survive, right? So there's always these unintended kind of things. I mean, I had the same kind of thing when I was in Tashkent several years ago. Putin invaded Ukraine, and suddenly in Tashkent you couldn't get an Uber because all the servers that run Uber, well, and there it's called Yandex, were in Russia. And so when they were imposing like sanctions and stuff on Putin, it meant that you could try to call yourself a ride, but it had to go through Russia, and the servers, couldn't do it. So who knew 4,000 miles away, somebody's invading Ukraine and now I can't get an Uber, you don't see these things coming.
Yeah. Because, at the bottom, underneath all of this is the thing is we want things, and that entails costs, and costs have their own logistical requirements. And if we're very, very, very lucky, all of those can be an honest bargain, but an honest trade. But generally, the larger the enterprise, the more people who are interested in maintaining it, the more likely you're going to have somebody at the bottom end somewhere getting the shaft in ways that they can't control. The T-shirt from Bangladesh thing. Yeah, well, your alternative is to walk around naked, really, because you could probably break down any piece of clothing and say, well, the thread came from here and they're doing it this way, and it was manufactured here and they're doing it this way. The only way you can do it is proactively, I think, by finding companies that do the same thing and just buying from them. But then you have to make your own judgment. The thing that I found remarkable in the Le Guin story is the fact that the entire community is aware. Everybody's told, and she makes a comment in the story that everybody is told around the age of 8 to 12. Now, boy, that would be an interesting class to have had when we were in grade school. Here's what your society is based on, and it's laid out for you at 8 to 12. Like, really, we get away with it usually by ignoring it and hoping nobody notices. I mean, there are some periods in history where the bandage comes off, the shroud is ripped away, and people see, and there's usually a reason why that happens. The civil rights movement, which had been boiling since the end of the Civil War, finally got its major moral comeuppance with television. because as soon as people in the north or the far west coast, etc., could actually see what was happening in Montgomery, Alabama, suddenly, oh my God! Up to that point, you could kind of politely suggest that those stories were exaggerations and that wasn't really happening. But now it's in your living room. Um, Same thing with Vietnam, though. I mean, people could actually turn on the nightly news every single night, see what was going on in Vietnam, and they were appalled. Um, the powers that be are fixing that by making sure you can't trust the images you see anymore.
Mm.
Interestingly enough, a lot of stories in science fiction have spurned replies. I mean, that used to be a regular feature in the old pulp magazines, that stories would trigger other stories, and there'd be an ongoing dialogue in fiction over several issues or several years. And I found two stories that are direct responses to Le Guin's story. One was Sarah Pinsker's The Ones Who Knew Where They Were Going, which, of course, that's a question in Omelas, the ones who walked away. Well, where did they go? Well, I mean, why would where they were going be any different? And Pinsker's kind of answers that. And then the more recent one is N.K. Jemisin did one called The Ones Who Stay and Fight, which is much more in your face. I mean, both stories are still written in that manner that Le Guin established of, let me show you something. Oh, you don't believe it? Well, here's this. And what Jemisin said is, we can have our utopia, but we have to recognize that it came from a place that was terrible, and that place still exists. And it exists that way because the people there are infected with an idea, and we must be militant in refusing valence to that idea. So when people from that other place come here, we don't let them in. That idea will infect us, and we will lose what we have. It's kind of stark. And now here's the other trade-off. You want to have utopia. Utopia is an idea. You have to defend utopia against competing ideas. And the only way to do that is to make sure that nobody shows up to voice those ideas. I find the trio of stories a good formulation for arguing that we've got to find some other way of interacting. Because they're all based on what we've known for 3,000 years. And we've gotten to a point now where we could potentially actually choose to talk to each other in a different way. But, and that's what science fiction really does well.
Well, it's very good for throwing, where you live now, right? It's always about where you live now. Mm-hmm. But if you put it in the future or on a spaceship, then people are more willing to read it and, read about those ideas.
Yeah.
I mean, the original Star Trek did that a lot, sometimes pretty ham-handedly, but they did it. Let this be your last battlefield being.
Oh, yeah.
Where you even see Uhura and Sulu, those guys on a break, right? Like in a break room. And someone says like what's racism or whatever. And that's something they had back in the 20th century.
Yeah. So I rather liked the one in The Next Generation where they thawed out the refugees from the 1990s or whatever. Mm-hmm. They found on the ship, and a couple of them are billionaires, and they're like, what do you mean there's no money?
Yeah, I have to remember that now. Yeah. They're going to be disappointed, I guess. But it's really hard to imagine a utopia, right? We seem to be really incapable of understanding what a paradise would really be. Like if you go to Kutna Hora, which we did a few years ago, we went to visit the Czech Republic. It's pretty infamous because the basement, the crypt, is where they got all these chandeliers and stuff made out of human bones. They hired some woodworking guy back in the 1800s to take all these piles of bones and turn them into something. And so there's all this art, and it's all from human pieces. Yeah. And then the upper chapel is supposed to represent heaven or whatever, or utopia, paradise, and it's just a bare white room basically. There's no art in it really. There's nothing really pretty about it. It's just painted bright white and it's just a room, And it's like, okay, so when we come to like the underworld here, we got all kinds of cool creative ideas. But when it comes to paradise, we're like, I don't know.
Well, that's very much a Dante-esque idea. Um, well, the history of utopia. R.A. Lafferty wrote a novel called Past Master, and it brought Thomas More back to life to solve a problem in the far future.
Okay.
And his Thomas More is walking around going, "What? You guys thought I was serious?" He said, "I wrote that as a joke." I mean, something like that. And you took it seriously? Well, no wonder you got everything all wrong. The Dante's Commedia is remarkable in a variety of ways. Of course, most people never get past Inferno because that's where all the cool special effects are. The really choice philosophical give and take happens in Purgatory. And Paradise is nowhere you would want to live because it is single-mindedly fixated on one single point. So the idea that the upper chamber, which is supposed to represent heaven, is just a white room, that's, to me, that rings of Dante. You have to give up being concerned with anything but this one fixed idea. And it can't be you. It has to be externalized. So it makes it the opposite of Inferno, where everybody is there because they have one fixed idea of themselves and will not modify that. But utopia, meaning technically nowhere, I think we have a contemporary misunderstanding or misapprehension of what that's supposed to be. We think it's supposed to be wonderful, but it's where no change ever happens. And when you think about that, that's just terrible. That's not. So I see all utopias as critiques of the desire to fix all the problems and have no more issues to deal with. Mm-hmm. Because then you don't.
People get bored.
You get bored or you stop being human.
Mm-hmm.
Your natural proclivities disappear or are so sublimated that so yes, in that sense, these are qualified utopias because they're terrible. They don't change, and the ones who walk away from Omelas, obviously, they're not changing anything. They're just refusing to participate. Mm-hmm. We see that today as the simplest way to protest what we don't like. We just won't participate. And sometimes that's effective, and sometimes it leads to abysmal results because some problems demand that you participate, at least engage the problem. Walking away from it just means the problem doesn't go away. You just have fewer people there to confront it. Mm-hmm. And I think we've seen that exampled in this country over the last, however long they've been keeping track of voting records when people don't vote. This is a republic that is designed to operate with close to full participation by the electorate. It works best when everybody has a say. When you leave it up to a minority, then that's what you get is minority rule. So things don't work the way you want. And the more they don't work the way you want, the more you refuse to participate, and the less they work the way you want. It's an endless cycle. But I also think that Gwynn pointed up a reality that is thorny, and most people, I think, object to it. And that is, you always make these trade-offs. We have a complex set of systems that provide us with what we want, and they don't work very well, and sometimes the result is awful for somebody. And we make these trade-offs all the time to get what we want. And of course, we are now convinced that if we do anything about those trade-offs, then we'll lose what we have. That's a false challenge. We have the capacity to not lose what we have whilst make whilst offering compensation to those we've abused. But even so, I mean, why do you need 200 channels of crap on your streaming service? Is that really that important to you, or that you don't want to pay writers just to bring it home to us? But it's so complex that the simplest way for any ruling system is to do its best to keep us from noticing, because they don't have any answers, and if people notice, they'll ask questions, and they don't have any answers. That's the simplest reason why things don't work right, I think, is we can't fix that. So we really rather you didn't know about it, because what are we supposed to do? But if to sticking to science fiction, though, the idea of the universal trade-off is a fixture. Before we started recording, we were talking about that Ender's Game is based on that. The trade-off is basically the abuse of a kid who has a talent in order to defeat an enemy, which may not even be an enemy. It may just simply be a war because of a misunderstanding. Then that goes all the way back to King Arthur. There was a snake on the field, and hence we had the last battle that destroyed everything. And then Logan's Run was another one we talked about, where the trade-off is we have a fixed population, we have to keep it at a fixed population. How do we get rid of the excess population? Soylent Green, again, although they're not actually killing people to do that, but we have to feed them. You mentioned Logan's Run, and Hunger Games is an updated take on that. There's got to be this contest, but really, we just have a system here of getting rid of the people who are the most likely to cause trouble, because they're the best and the brightest. There was a short story about I forget who wrote it, but they did it on the 80s version of the Twilight Zone, where the kid has to go take an IQ test. The state tests you for your intelligence. And the tragedy, of course, is that if you're too smart, they kill you. Because if you're too smart, that will destabilize things. And then on the other end of that, Isaac Asimov wrote a story about the ultimate vote, where they have pared down the statistical analysis of voting trends to where they find one guy, and he gets one vote, and he's representative of the whole thing.
I'm not sure in that story, did he even vote, or did it just the AI talk to him for like an hour or two and then kind of got his beliefs on things and then passed? No,
he had to make a decision.
It's so long since I read that story.
All there, but he had to actually push the button.
Okay.
Because that makes you complicit.
Yeah.
It's not just a discussion. Then you've made a choice.
Well, they directly did the same thing on New Who, where when it's like Matt Smith's second episode, where Spaceship UK is depending on torturing a star whale to keep their spaceship together, and but everyone is told about this once they reach a certain age. But if you agree to let your society continue to torture the star whale, then you press a button and it wipes your memory of it. And but if you press no, then they're gonna let the star whale go, and Spaceship UK will kill everybody. Basically, is what they think.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to, if you want the spaceship to keep going, everyone to still be alive, then you have to press yes, and then 5 years later you'll go and they'll tell you again, and you have to vote again, and then forget for the next 5 years. But everyone knows that there's this something going on. They just don't know what it is. That's some of this because they keep being forced to forget. But so obviously at some point someone chooses to release the star whale. And the ship doesn't fall apart, so you don't necessarily know that the consequence that you're warned of is actually going to happen to you. But you want to stay away from just killing everyone. So
yeah.
That choice it keeps popping up in different science fiction things.
Yeah. And the need to make people complicit or ignorant, the whole bit. I mean, basically 1984 is like that. Brave New World was the one example where everybody seemed to know exactly what was going on.
Mhm.
They didn't exactly know why, but I think the thing that makes Aldous Huxley's Brave New World superior in all ways to 1984 is the intricate way in which everyone is trapped in that system and has gotten to a point where the savage, the poor guy who's running around who knows Shakespeare, looks like an idiot. And he even looks like an idiot to the reader because by the time he's back there, it's like, what are you complaining about? And you have to really step back and say, what's wrong with this system? Because everybody's happy.
Everybody's happy. And even the people who object get sent to an island where they can all be like bitched together. I mean, they're not like they're killed or anything
Yeah.
or forced
Yeah.
to work. They just get to go and complain just with
Yeah.
each other. And so it's like they're still happy in the sense that what they want to do is complain all the time when they get the chance to.
We make that, and we make that bargain all the time. Most of the time it's not that pernicious.
Mhm.
It's just small little things that you have to, go along to get along, and 90% of the time nobody's going to suffer really from that kind of a trade-off. But there are some, basic ones that are if and to a large extent I can understand people who argue that we here in the United States should not be involved in all that because our ancestors came here specifically to get away from that. How successful were they? Well, we built our own version of it. But it all seems to hinge on the inability of a lot of us to recognize the common humanity of everyone. There's always somebody that doesn't come up to snuff, doesn't fit the profile, doesn't, why should I care about them? And as long as there's that pecking order idea, we're going to have these kinds of situations. And
it always has to be an other.
Oh yeah, we all need another. This past year, I sat down and tackled Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, which I think should be taught in 8th grade. I really do. It's the first third of it is an explication of the sociocultural byways by which we come to the place where woman as a concept must fill a certain role to the benefit of the state and individual males, and the centuries and millennia-long process of othering her has resulted in a place where the argument almost seems intractable. Because when you present it to some people, they cannot understand what it is you're talking about unless you follow them around all day for a year and say, see, you did it there. See, you did it there. And then it might finally, if they're not so annoyed that they beat you up, they begin to see that all these little things that I've just taken for granted continually subject women to second-class status. But it's just the way we breathe now. And she laid that out magnificently. And she lays it on the patriarchy, which is easy, and to a large extent I agree with, but I think it is also endemic in human nature that there's always going to be people who feel that they need to see themselves as special. In order to get to that point, they have to other everybody else. I believe that most. Oh, this is getting off topic. But I'll say it. I believe that most men who are abusers of women would be abusers of men as well if they thought they could get away with it. But men can walk away. They can, to bring it back to, you see what we did there?
Yeah, they can walk away from from the problem. So yeah, it's a very short story. If you haven't read it, you can find it online actually. So yeah, there's just a lot of ideas presented there. And then then you start thinking about your own life and how much you don't walk away and how many things you've compromised on. It is something that you might not think about unless you I guess read a story like that, and or at least a tiny bit self-aware. But that's one of the things that we said that science fiction is pretty good at doing.
We didn't even mention the Star Trek Strange New Worlds episode that was based on this.
I heard there was one. I haven't seen Stranger World yet because I haven't had all the streaming services. So
Oh my gosh.
I know
They
it's
had
like
an episode which is clearly, I mean, they didn't credit the story, which kind of annoys me, but it is so clearly based on the ones who walk away from Omelas. Only there, it's not a kid in the basement that's just suffering. It's a kid that's the central processing unit of the machine that keeps everything running. And essentially, they sacrifice this kid to this machine because, they have to get another kid because it burns them up over time. But it's this is the decision we have made. And they're all explaining it to themselves. We have to do this because all of this would fall apart if we don't. And what would all these people do? And, why should they suffer because of your, Pike is sitting there saying you can't do this. And he says, why should all these people suffer for your morality? Which is, that's the hidden question that makes this such a thorny philosophical issue.
yeah. Yeah, you got to be pretty strict Kantian to ignore all the consequences.
Yeah, and I don't even think Kant was a strict Kantian in that regard.
Yeah.
I think regarding that, I think on some level we still haven't got a good handle on the problem because we keep framing it in terms of individual response to immediate circumstances rather than looking under the hood, as it were. Seeing why does the system keep presenting us with this trade-off every single time. I was talking to a friend the other day, and we were talking naturally enough because of current circumstances, autocracies. And I said, the thing that always gets me about autocracies is that it never seems to occur to any of them, with a very few exceptions, that if they really want to just stay in power and they want to have, feed people, give them housing, clothe them. I mean, the seeds of your destruction lie in the fact that you sit on them with this giant iron hand and they actually want for things. What the hell? Yeah. Give it to them. And she pointed out that the only example she could think of where they actually tried to do that was Castro's Cuba. He actually tried to be a public servant. Of course, ideologically they had, their political prisoners and such, but they had medical care, they had housing, they had food. He did everything that the Batista regime was not doing. But of course, it cost a great deal of external input. They have huge amounts of Soviet investment in Cuba in order to pay for that. But the others don't even bother to make the attempt, and that's always troubled me.
Yeah, I always wondered. You get these stories where someone wants to rule everything, right, and be the autocrat. And I always thought, well, let's say you win and you rule everything, then you have to administer it, right? Yeah. And that's the big problem. Then you have to solve all the problems. And so I keep wondering, if Denis Villeneuve makes Dune Messiah, because that's basically Dune Messiah, right? In the first book, Paul becomes emperor. The second book, then you got to figure out how to rule the dang thing, right? And there's all these committee meetings and people plotting against him, and and the hard part is actually getting into work after, right?
Oh yeah. Well, just an observation. Note how many people, Americans, think that the war was the revolution that we had. The revolution was the Constitution. The war was just the rebellion. The actual revolution was in the committee meetings in 1789.
But I guess that's something that Omelas gets away from. We don't seem to have any kind of committees going on there. They have this deal and they just compromise and go with it.
Yeah, well, that's what makes it a utopia. It's nowhere.
Yeah.
But
And oh, okay. That train left. Never mind. Go ahead.
uh, and utopias are nice. They're little philosophical problem solving machines. You wind them up and you put them on the table and see where they go. But you necessarily have to leave out certain key components. I mean, uh, once you start, and to me, this is what separates a lot of science fiction from a lot of fantasy. Is you ask the simple question: how is this actually materially supposed to work? Who pays for it? Where's the food come from? Who does the carpentry? Where's the power coming from that runs all the machines? And those pesky little materialist questions that foul up a good utopia every time. How is this actually supposed to work? Logan's Run is a good example. They never actually show anybody doing any work.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you assume that they are, but when? And because it's a very high tech,
Yeah, the
civilization.
Sandmen have jobs. Well, there are people that work in the salon, I guess, where they did the plastic surgery. I think in the book, it's like the first 7 years you're in the nursery, and the second 7 years you kind of like just get everything for free, and the third 7 years you're given some kind of job. I mean, it's probably just to keep you
Yeah,
busy and not really necessary. The machines are doing everything, but yeah, you get some kind of responsibility, and then at the end of your third 7 years, when you're 21, is when you get off. So I
yeah,
do kind of get some kind of, but probably if they weren't doing those jobs, the machines would be just doing them just fine. So, they're more like distractions, I guess, than jobs.
yeah. But when you get into that, though, it distracts you from the point of the story, and for that you need a novel length. I did do a long interview with Ursula Le Guin via video link through the Daniel Boone Library. There was one year when The Dispossessed was the state big read, and they asked me could you do an interview with Ursula Le Guin? Oh my God, talk about being on the hot seat. I'm like, oh, I'm going to talk to Ursula Le Guin for an hour. She was delightful. But The Dispossessed, I think, would be a more grounded version of The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, because she has these two systems that are diametrically opposed, and you can see the difference in both of them. But she also pointed out the flaws in both of them. I mean, the anarchist society on the moon is not exactly a bed of roses either. They've got some assumptions that make it impossible to. I mean, the main character leaves and flees to the homeworld because he can't do his work under the so-called utopians on the moon. Of course, when he gets to the planet, he's going to only be allowed to do his work if it contributes to the war machine. So that's just one trade-off after another through the whole novel, and she was quite happy to talk about that. She goes, well, obviously I'm on the side of the anarchists, but they have problems too.
Yeah, you had said that utopia basically inherently is tyrannical. Talk about that for a minute.
Well, because it presupposes that we have reached a point where history stops. We have literally solved all of the problems, and everything is as it should be in an ideal way. Human nature being what it is, somebody has to be sitting there saying, no, you can't change anything. And which, by extension is tyrannical.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be content with the status quo in perpetuity. And that, to me, is an appalling idea. I'm sure that there's a lot of people that might be quite happy living that way, but for the most part, that's a formula for eventual decay and collapse. But yeah, it also, if you go back to Plato, Plato's Republic is a utopia, and it's posited, if you recall, on the noble lie, that we segregate people into their slots in life: people of brass, people of silver, people of gold, and the people of gold rule. The people of silver, they have their function, and then the people of bronze do all the grunt work. or brass do all of the grunt work. And we have to tell them that this is natural. This is the way it must be for all this to work. And that's the noble lie. We have to convince them that they should not complain about their status. So if somebody is born into the brass class who has aspirations to be gold, too bad. We've already convinced the parents to shut that down. And that kind of tyranny has gradations. It depends on how unstable the population finds itself being in its apprehensions of their desires in the world. But at the end of the day, it's, we're done. We're not progressing. We're not regressing. We're here. So stop. And yeah, I think that is fundamentally tyrannical.
Okay, well, that was quite a bit of interesting ideas. If you want to read the stories I said, you can find it online. There are also some YouTube videos of people giving their opinions on the story, so you can watch those as well if you find the story interesting. And I hope you will come back and join us again later, and certainly hit like and subscribe, and maybe even that little bell notification when I upload videos in the future. And that's all for today. And thank you, Mark, for joining us.
And fun.